Welcome to the debate. Today, we're dissecting a framework that claims to solve what is maybe the single biggest stressor in modern life, money. We're looking at the automatic economy, a concept really championed by the financial author David Back. And the thesis here is pretty confrontational. It argues that the reason most people struggle financially isn't just about what they earn, but about the system they're fighting. I mean, the modern economy is engineered to extract wealth from you through frictionlessness. Subscriptions, one-click ordering, all these invisible payments. Back argues the only way to win is to reverse the machinery, to make creating wealth just as automatic and just as mindless as spending it.
It's a really compelling narrative, right? Because it gives you a clear villain, the system, and a very clear hero, which is automation. But we have to ground this in reality. We're analyzing this against a backdrop where, according to recent data, something like 70% of the population is living paycheck to paycheck. So the core question for us is this: is the automatic millionaire framework a universal behavioral hack that just bypasses human weakness? Or does it fundamentally trivialize the structural economic reality for the working class? Is this advice for everyone, or is it just for the people who already have enough slack in the rope to pull themselves up?
That is the crux of it, yeah. I represent the position that, behavioral automation is the single most effective tool we have to counter what Bach calls the no-plan plan. The data is just so clear. Human beings we're terrible at relying on willpower. Bach's argument, which I stand by, is that the math of compound interest, when you couple it with a pay-yourself-first principle, it creates a safety net that is accessible to the vast majority of people, provided they're willing to prioritize their values over, say, immediate convenience.
And I'm here to challenge that idea of universality. I don't dispute the math. Compound interest is irrefutable, of course. But I'm taking the position that while the mechanics are sound, the application assumes a level of disposable income that frankly just doesn't exist for the working poor. When you frame financial struggle as a lack of planning, you risk overlooking systemic wage stagnation and the rising cost of everything. You just can't automate what you don't have.
Okay, but let's unpack that, because the definition of what you have is often where this whole disagreement starts. The no-plan plan. It creates a vacuum. But Aj's point is that the reason 7 out of 10 people struggle isn't solely their income level, though that's obviously a huge factor, but it's because they operate without a system. The default setting for the human brain in this consumer economy is to just spend whatever's available in the checking account. The proposed solution is the 1 hour a day rule.
Walk us through the mechanics of that.
It's a simple metric to cut through the noise. You save the equivalent of the first hour of your income every single day. Mathematically, if you work roughly 8 hours a day, 1 hour is about 12.5% of your gross pay. The strategy isn't just to save it in a bank account. It's to direct it immediately into a tax-advantaged account like a 401k or an IRA.
And that tax advantage part is the critical lever here, isn't it?
Exactly. This is all about skipping the IRS. If you're in a standard tax bracket, earning $1 usually means you take home 70 or 80 cents after federal and state taxes. But if you move that first hour directly into a pre-tax retirement account, every single penny goes to work for you before the government even touches it. It creates an immediate return. Bach cites data from Fidelity showing there are currently 565,000 401k millionaires on their books. And these aren't day traders or lottery winners. They got there in an average of 26 years just by saving roughly 14% of their income. To me, that's empirical proof that ordinary people, through consistency, not luck, can achieve financial exit velocity.
I appreciate the data. And sure, 565,000 people is a lot in a stadium, but in a workforce of 160 million people, it's a statistical outlier. That's less than half of 1%. When we see that 7 out of 10 people are living paycheck to paycheck, that points to a systemic crisis, not a mass failure of personal discipline. My issue with the 1 hour a day rule is its rigidity. Asking a low-wage worker to essentially give themselves a 12% pay cut is structurally different from a high earner doing the same.
But is it a pay cut, or is it a reallocation?
For someone on the edge, it is a cut in survival funds. If you earn $40,000 a year, that 12% is your rent, or your heat, or high-quality food. It's not discretionary. And the automatic economy premise, it cuts both ways. Yes, technology makes it easier to invest through apps, but that same frictionless economy is designed to extract wealth from the vulnerable faster than they can save it. The phone in your pocket is a money magnet. For a single mother working 2 jobs, the automatic bills often hit her account before the automatic savings can ever trigger. The system is just faster than the saver.
I accept that the friction is high, but we have to look at the let me versus the let them mindset. This is a crucial distinction in the material.
Let them focuses on what the economy or the government is doing, things you can't control. Let me focuses on the variables you can control. Bach proposes this thought experiment that's really difficult to dismiss. He asks audiences, if your employer came in today and said, times are tough, we need to cut your pay by 10% or we have to let you go, would you stay?
Well, most people would stay because they have no other choice.
Correct. They would grumble, they'd be stressed, but they would stay. And crucially, they would survive. They'd adjust their lifestyle to fit the new reality because the alternative is unemployment. So the argument is, if you can survive a 10% cut for your boss to save the company, you can certainly afford to tax yourself 10% for your own future freedom. It's about reframing savings not as a luxury you do with leftover money, but as a mandatory bill, just like rent.
That is a powerful psychological reframe, I'll grant you that. It exposes how adaptable we are when we're forced. But it segues right into the most controversial part of this philosophy, the latte factor.
The famous or infamous latte factor.
It's this idea that small, daily luxuries are what destroy your future wealth. Bach holds up a break of $10,000 cash and points out that blowing that amount only takes $27.40 a day. He argues that in our modern economy of Uber Eats and streaming subscriptions, finding $27 a day in waste is just a matter of auditing.
And mathematically, he's right. If you invest that $27.40 a day at a 10% return, you end up with millions over a lifetime.
But let's look at the sociology of that advice for a second. For someone earning minimum wage or even a little bit above, finding $10,000 a year in waste is a fantasy. That is literally a third or maybe half of some people's entire take-home pay. The latte factor creates this guilt complex around the few small pleasures that working class people actually have. It assumes that the consumption habits of the upper middle class, daily Starbucks, Ubers, are universal. They're not.
Well, I think you're taking the latte a bit too literally. It's a metaphor for unconscious spend. It might not be coffee. It could be the unused gym membership, the streaming service you forgot about, a data plan that's way too expensive, or the interest you're paying on a credit card because you missed one payment. The principle is just that we bleed money in small cuts.
The principle scales down, but the impact changes. If you tell a person in deep poverty to cut $27 a day, you're not telling them to cut coffee. You're telling them to cut nutrition or medicine. The pay yourself first model works beautifully for the middle class who suffer from lifestyle creep, that tendency to spend more as you earn more. But it can be completely alienating for those where adjusting to a lower net income means eviction. We have to be really careful not to conflate convenience culture with survival spending.
That's a fair distinction. However, even for those with modest means, the source material emphasizes that you don't have to start at 14% or 12%. You can start at 1%. The act of automating even a single percent begins to shift your identity from a consumer to an owner. It builds the muscle. But let's shift to where that money actually goes, because this is where the debate moves from behavior to mechanics. The automatic philosophy champions simplicity over sophistication.
This is the boredom is good strategy.
Precisely. The advice is to reject complexity. No individual stock picking, no timing the market, no watching financial news. You use target date mutual funds or broad index funds.
For our listeners who might not know, can you clarify what a target date fund is actually doing under the hood?
Sure. A target date fund is basically a fund of funds. You just pick the year you plan to retire, let's say 2055. The fund manager automatically buys a mix of stocks and bonds that's appropriate for your age. When you're young, it's aggressive, mostly stocks, to capture growth. As you get closer to 2055, it automatically shifts more towards bonds to protect your money from volatility. You don't do anything. It's the ultimate set it and forget it.
And the alternative, the indexed fund?
Even simpler. Take something like VTI, the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF. It holds, I think, around 3,600 stocks. So when you buy one share of VTI, you effectively own a microscopic piece of almost every public company in America. Apple, Microsoft, sure, but also the small regional banks and industrial firms. Bach notes that the 100-year market average is roughly 10% returns. If a 20-year-old invests that latte factor money into a fund like that, the math compounds to over $4.4 million in 40 years. This approach stops young people from gambling on, as Bach calls them, meme stocks or crypto, which so often leads to a total loss of capital. It transforms investing from a casino into a utility.
That is the ideal scenario, but I have to introduce a concept called leakage, because the automatic system has a major structural flaw. The system is technically rigged for investors, yes, but it is also rigged to penalize mistakes very, very harshly.
You're talking about what happens when people change jobs.
Precisely.
We have a mobile workforce now. People switch jobs every few years. Vanguard did a study showing that failing to roll over a 401k correctly when changing jobs is a massive wealth destroyer. When you leave a job, you have to move that money to an IRA or to your new employer. But it's a manual process. If you forget, or if you just cash it out because the balance looks small, say $10,000, you get hit with taxes and a 10% penalty.
And the loss of the compound curve.
That's the bigger cost. A young person cashing out $10,000 isn't just losing 10 grand. They're losing the $150,000 that money would have grown into by retirement. And then there's the default setting problem. If you get opted into a new plan at a default 3% savings rate, but you were previously saving 14% and you just don't notice for 5 years, well, that error can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. The whole set it and forget it mantra can lull people into a false sense of security about the logistics of their money.
I'd argue those are solvable implementation errors, not a flaw in the strategy itself. It just highlights the need for what Bach calls a money date, a regular review. But let's look at the other side of the balance sheet, debt. This is where Bach's approach really deviates from pure mathematics and leans heavily into psychology. He advocates for the DOLP system.
Done on last payment.
Right. This is his version of the snowball method. You list your debts and you pay off the card with the smallest balance first, regardless of the interest rate. Now, a pure mathematician would scream at this. They'd say you must pay the highest interest rate first, the avalanche method, because that saves the most money, mathematically speaking.
And the mathematician is objectively correct. If a debtor ignores a 29% interest rate card to pay off a 0% or low-interest small balance, they are bleeding capital. They're paying a stupidity tax for a psychological boost.
But Bach argues that debt is a behavioral problem, not a math problem. If math were the only factor, people wouldn't be in debt in the first place. Getting a quick win, physically closing an account, that provides the dopamine hit and the hope you need to keep going. If you just stare at a massive balance on a high-interest card for 3 years with no visible progress, you give up. The DOLP system prioritizes momentum over efficiency.
I understand the behavioral argument, but for those in deep financial distress, the people we identified earlier as living on the edge, mathematical efficiency is survival. Paying the highest interest first stops the bleeding fastest. And what's more, Bach's requirement to just stop using credit cards during this phase ignores the reality of the working poor. Many families use debt not for consumerism, but to bridge the gap between their wages and living costs at the end of the month. Telling them to cut up the cards is like telling them to disconnect their lifeline.
It is harsh medicine, certainly, but reliance on credit for survival is a spiral that just ends in bankruptcy. The DOLP system at least offers a structured exit ramp. Now, I want to touch on maybe the most contentious point in the current economic climate: home ownership. Boggess is unequivocal here. He asserts that home ownership is the primary driver of generational wealth in America. Renters, he says, are left behind because they don't build equity.
He uses the escalator analogy for this.
Yes. Imagine the economy is a mall. If you're a renter, you are running on a treadmill. You might be running fast, working hard, but you stay in the same place. If you own a home, you're just standing on an escalator. Even if you stand still, the market carries you up. His advice is to buy the smallest thing possible: a studio, a fixer-upper, a bad commute. Just get on the escalator.
That advice feels like a relic from a different era. We have to look at the barriers to entry now. The source material mentions a staggering statistic. Roughly 40% of home buyers now get down payment assistance from family. That immediately splits the population into those who have generational wealth and those who don't.
But for those who don't, the advice is to lower expectations, not give up.
But how low can you go? In markets like Boston, New York, or San Francisco, even the starter homes, the studios, the fixers, are completely out of reach for prudent savers. The math just doesn't work for a median income earner. Telling people to buy anything ignores the reality that for many, the choice is between leaving their community and their job market entirely or just remaining renters. And let's be clear, leaving a job market often means lowering your earning potential, which defeats the whole purpose. The automatic economy of real estate is becoming a closed loop for people who already have capital.
I can see that the barrier to entry is higher than ever. However, if you look at the data on widows and divorce, the financial precarity of not owning assets becomes a crisis later in life. The average age of widowhood is 59. If you are renting at 59 and you lose your spouse's income, you are in a much more dangerous position than if you own a paid-off or nearly paid-off small home.
That is a chilling statistic.
It is, and it's why Bach suggests funding a dream account specifically for a down payment, separate from retirement. It requires sacrifice, yes. It might mean not living in the trendy neighborhood, but the alternative is arriving at retirement with absolutely no housing security.
I agree that the vulnerability of widows is a critical point, but I maintain that suggesting home ownership is just a matter of prioritizing overlooks the fact that for that 40% getting help, the game was won before it even started. For the other 60%, it's an uphill battle that requires more than just automated savings. It requires systemic policy changes in housing supply.
We can agree the system is difficult, but we have to operate within the reality we have. This brings us to the ultimate conclusion of Bach's philosophy. While the system may be rigged, the automatic approach is the only variable an individual can actually control. You can't control interest rates, you can't control the housing market, you can't control your employer's pay structure. What you can control is whether you save 1% or 14%. You can control whether you open the mail or hide from it.
And there is value in that agency.
Exactly. Whether it's a full 14% or just starting with $10 a day in a jar, the act of automating savings changes your identity. It shifts you from being a victim of the economy to a participant in it. As Bach says, it's never too late. He cites the woman in her 50s starting with just $20 a day. It didn't make her a multimillionaire, but it gave her a $500,000 cushion by 65. That's the difference between dignity and destitution.
I will grant you that action is always superior to inaction. The no plan is a disaster for everyone, regardless of their income level. And I do appreciate the concept of the money date, sitting down with a partner or just yourself to get clarity. Knowledge is power, and knowing where the money goes is the first step. However, while the advice is sound for those with discretionary income, we have to remain critical of an economic system where 70% of the population needs what amounts to extreme budgeting measures just to survive. Automation is a powerful tool, but it's not a magic wand that fixes a crisis of income inequality.
It is not a magic wand, no, but it is a ladder. And for many people, it is the only ladder available. The let me mindset is about grabbing the rungs that are within your reach rather than waiting for someone to lower an elevator.
A fair point. Ultimately, the material forces us to ask, is financial freedom a math problem to be solved through compounded returns, or is it a structural problem that requires us to rethink how we value labor and living costs?
And perhaps for the listener, it's a bit of both. It requires the discipline to automate what you can and the wisdom to know that the system requires vigilance to navigate.
We hope this discussion has helped you look at your own automatic settings a little differently.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate. We'll see you next time.